Hello all. My name is Kara Mae Brown, and I'm an associate teaching professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Welcome to my talk called Nanofiction, Attention, and Care, Very Short Lessons in Building Classroom Community. First, I want to take a moment to thank the organizers of the conference from the Creative Writing Studies organization, who have been smart, brave, and humane in not only offering this conference online, as is appropriate for during an ongoing pandemic, but also for putting into practice the kind of care that this conference seeks to explore. So thank you. The line of thinking that I'm presenting today started in January of 2021. I was reading Matthew Salesi's brand new release, Craft in the Real World, Rethinking Fiction Writing and Workshopping, as a part of my preparation to teach an Introduction to Creative Writing course in the spring. The book lays out one of its central theses as the title of the first chapter, Pure Craft is a Lie. Salesi's first premise is one that will come as no surprise to folks doing work in cultural rhetorics, namely that all writing is cultural. That is, the language choices, what we creatives call craft, that writers make on the page will inevitably reflect cultural values and assumptions. The critique Salesi's levels at craft and extends to the workshop is clear and urgent. Quote, we must be careful not to frame craft as prescription or even guidelines without first making it clear where those guidelines come from and whom they benefit. In many workshops and many craft books, the dominance of one tradition of craft, serving one particular audience, white, middle class, straight, able, etc., is essentially literary imperialism, a term that should make us wary of the danger, especially to emerging minority and marginalized voices, unquote. I confess that between takes of this video, I'm also watching an extension of this argument taking shape in the live tweets of Asao Inoue's keynote address at the Conference for Anti-Racist Teaching, Language, and Assessment, which include this necessary provocation. Quote, if we use singular standards for languaging that our white supremacist systems have given all of us, then guess which side of the language race war you're fighting on, end quote. Indeed, the workshop has been born of those systems and, as such, the languaging that those workshops compel. All of this is to say that workshops may well be doing harm, especially to the minority and marginalized voices Salesi speaks of, but to everyone really by making us complicit in systems of oppression. Given this context, once I started teaching that course on Intro to Creative Writing, I started to wonder what it would look like then to create a workshop that, rather doing harm, became a site of care. What if care, rather than critique, became the primary mode of the workshop? What would it look like to use what I'm tentatively calling a method of generative care to help each writer realize their goals for their manuscripts? And can forms of very short fiction, flash, micro, nano, whatever term you prefer, or form you prefer, that is, provide a vehicle for that care by focusing our attention on questions of language? And of course, these questions arose for me out of the emergency remote teaching that occurred during academic year 2020 and 2021, where my institution stayed remote for the entire academic year. It wasn't my first time teaching entirely online, but it was my first time teaching in a pandemic. Though by spring of 2021, when I taught the Introduction to Creative Writing course that spurred this inquiry, I had observed the effects of online teaching and learning on our students. Many were detached when they were present at all, present meaning attending to the class in the way that the class asked, so by Zoom or by completing asynchronous assignments, etc. Many reported new or heightened feelings of anxiety and depression, and many, myself included, were struggling to find meaning in the work of an education. I teach at a public R1 university, but within that, a small college within that university called the College of Creative Studies, which does not assign grades and that encourages students to take their work as undergraduate artists and researchers seriously. The 12 students in my Introduction to Creative Writing class were all new to the writing and literature major offered in our college, having earned their seats through a supplemental application in which they expressed their interests, goals, and ability in writing. They were a racially, ethnically diverse group, as well as representing a non-binary number of genders and sexual orientations. For our first assignment, I asked students to complete an exercise from Pam Painter and Anne Bernay's What If, called Nanofiction, contributed by Michael Hennessy. The assignment essentially asked students to write stories that are 3 sentences long. In advance, students had read Szalasi's chapter referenced above, and we were using some of his recommended workshop strategies, including a focus on observing, questioning, and identifying possibilities, rather than inviting a straight critique. My goals in this assignment were to start the course by focusing on language, rather than on larger concerns like narrative or character, in order to highlight that making choices of language is always the essence of our work, and also to use these short assignments as a vehicle for teaching these students how to workshop productively. During this assignment and the workshop that followed, I observed a number of different kinds of care, including care for one another's language, care for craft decisions, care for one another's work, and care for each other as individuals. I wanted to ask more questions about this kind of care, especially given that the care I observed flowed from student to student, whereas in much of the literature on pedagogies of care, the care is given by the teacher for the students. In his 2015 dissertation, Andrew Shane Larson outlines 8 ways college students perceive care, including verbal expressions of care, nonverbal expressions of care, knowing student names, displaying care and concern during office hours, making an effort to know students, creating interesting and applicable lessons, addressing student concerns during class, and the existence of a feeling of care. However, I think in a workshop setting, it is important to disrupt the authority of the instructor, as I and many others have written about elsewhere. I'm curious to better understand how we might come up with principles of care in a workshop setting in which both the individual and the work itself is the object of that care. How might such principles change our workshop practices to make them more inclusive and more generative? Then there is the question of how very short forms might lend themselves to this kind of workshop as caring model, and particularly to teaching it, which I suspect had something to do with the attention paid to the details. Attention is, of course, a central tenet of mindfulness. In his 2008 article on Paying Attention, Flagpole as Mindfulness in Teaching Writing, Keith Kroll observes how his students struggle to pay attention. He says, quote, "It is no surprise that my students struggle to pay attention, to be in the moment, to be present. In class, they appear to be somewhere else in the next moment." While his observation is based more on the busyness of his community college students' lives, I can't help but think that the struggle to pay attention has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, by the insurrection on January 6th, and the ongoing violence of systemic racism and the escalating disasters related to the climate crisis. Kroll, as many others have since, offers mindfulness practice, the art of paying attention to the present moment, as a balm for his students' inattentiveness. In my own classroom, I suspect that the smallness of very short fiction, the way it allows us as readers to stay present by staying on the page rather than flipping through multiple pages, might focus the mind like a mantra or breathing exercise that often accompanies meditation. Again, these are ideas that require further investigation, and I'm curious about how we might leverage what we know about mindfulness and its benefits in the workshop. How might very short forms facilitate that kind of learning, that kind of attention? And can such mindfulness be a cornerstone of a workshop based on generative care? And so I've reached that point in this line of inquiry where I've just generated new lines of inquiry, but maybe more importantly, I've generated, I think, 2 really clear follow-up goals. One is to identify the principles of generative care that might guide a creative writing workshop. And the second is to investigate very short fiction as a vehicle for mindfulness in a workshop. Perhaps in doing so, I might find that there is a link, that something about mindfulness and contemplation that underlies care. In any case, I'm excited for the opportunity to discuss these ideas further with the conference participants. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.